when 68-year-old Eleanor Whitmore is dropped off at a shabby roadside motel with nothing but a suitcase and the sting of her daughter's rejection. It feels like the final blow in a life marked by quiet sacrifices. Once the pillar of her family, Eleanor now faces the bitter truth. Her daughter, Rachel, can no longer afford to care for a mother who has nothing left to give. But days after Eleanor disappears without a trace, Rachel stumbles upon an old, dust-covered letter wedged behind a drawer in her mother's bedroom, postmarked decades earlier and never opened. Its contents send a chill through her that won't let go. Haunted by guilt and questions she can't answer, Rachel is forced to retrace a past her mother never spoke of, one marked by a childhood tragedy, a missing person, and a house her family never returned to. As she peels back the layers of Eleanor's silent pain, Rachel begins to see her mother not as a burden, but as the keeper of a story no one was ever supposed to uncover. The rain came down in sheets, a gray curtain that blurred the edges of the world beyond the cracked motel window. Eleanor Whitmore sat on the edge of the bed, her thin frame swallowed by the creaky mattress. The room smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke, though she hadn't smoked a day in her life. Her hands trembled as they gripped the handle of her battered suitcase, a relic from another time, its leather scuffed and peeling at the corners. She could still hear Rachel's voice echoing in her mind, sharp and brittle like breaking glass. "I can't do this anymore, Mom. I'm sorry." It wasn't just the words. It was the way Rachel had said them. Exhausted, desperate, defeated. As if caring for Eleanor were something to endure rather than cherish. Eleanor stared out into the storm, watching headlights blur past on the wet highway. Cars sped by without stopping, their drivers oblivious to the woman left behind at the Pine Ridge Motel. She felt invisible, an afterthought in her own story. Her fingers tightened around the suitcase's handle until her knuckles turned white. Inside, there were no treasures, no jewelry or keepsakes worth anything tangible. Just old photographs, yellowed letters tied with ribbon, and a few trinkets she'd held onto through the years. Things Rachel would never understand. Her gaze drifted downward to the small table near the door, where a hollowed-out book lay open beside her purse. Its pages had been carefully carved away long ago, creating a secret compartment. Inside rested a single key, tarnished with age but unmistakably significant. Eleanor reached over and closed the book gently, running her thumb along its worn spine. A shiver ran through her, not from cold, but from memory. "Take care of her," James had whispered, his voice barely audible over the steady beep of hospital monitors. His hand had been so light in hers, fragile as tissue paper. He'd known even then what Eleanor refused to admit, that she wasn't ready. Not for widowhood, not for the silence that followed him everywhere he used to be, and certainly not for the role of burden, which she now seemed destined to play. Tears welled up unbidden, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She wiped them away quickly, angry at herself for crying again, for being weak, for needing too much when everyone else already gave all they could. But the memories wouldn't leave her alone tonight. The sound of James's laughter, the warmth of his arms, the crushing finality of his absence. They clung to her like ghosts, whispering reminders of everything she'd lost. Outside, thunder rumbled low and distant, shaking the thin walls of the motel. Eleanor pulled the suitcase closer, resting it against her knees. With trembling hands, she unlatched the lid and began sifting through its contents. There was a photograph of James holding baby Rachel, both of them smiling under the summer sun. Another showed Eleanor herself, younger and vibrant, standing beside her husband outside their first home. Back then, the future had seemed endless, full of promise. Now, it felt more like a countdown. As she sifted through the mementos, her fingers brushed against something hard tucked beneath the photos. She paused, pulling out a small wooden box no bigger than her palm. Its surface was smooth, polished by years of handling. She opened it slowly, revealing a folded piece of paper inside. Written in James's neat handwriting were 2 lines. Some doors should stay closed, others need you to find them. Eleanor frowned, her heart quickening despite herself. What had he meant? She'd found the note months after his death, hidden among his things, and it had haunted her ever since. Tonight, sitting alone in this God-forsaken place, it felt heavier somehow, as if it carried more weight than nostalgia or grief. A car engine roared somewhere outside, jolting her back to the present. She glanced toward the window, half expecting to see Rachel's headlights pulling into the lot. But the road remained empty, indifferent to her longing. With a sigh, Eleanor closed the box and returned it to the suitcase. Then, almost unconsciously, she rose from the bed and retrieved the hollowed-out book from the table. She opened it once more, staring at the tarnished key nestled within. Whatever it unlocked, whatever secrets it guarded, she knew one thing for certain. It was meant for her. James had trusted her with it, even if she didn't yet understand why. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside room 12 of the Pine Ridge Motel, silence settled like a heavy blanket. Eleanor sat back down on the bed, clutching the book to her chest. Sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. Not with the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders and the mystery of the key gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. And somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of regret and quiet pain, a flicker of determination stirred. Whatever James had left for her to find, she owed it to him and to herself to uncover it. Rachel stood in the doorway of her mother's bedroom, the familiar scent of lavender and old wood lingering faintly in the air. It had only been 2 days since she'd dropped Eleanor off at the motel, but already the room felt different, emptier, as if the walls themselves missed her presence. The silence pressed against Rachel's chest, heavy and suffocating. She hadn't wanted to come back here so soon, but there was no one else to sort through Eleanor's things, no one willing, anyway. She sighed, shaking off the weight of guilt that clung to her like a second skin. Guilt for leaving Eleanor behind. Guilt for not being enough. Guilt for feeling relieved, even just a little, when the car door slammed shut and she drove away. Pushing aside the tangled mess of emotions, Rachel stepped inside. The room was exactly as Eleanor had left it. Neat to the point of rigidity, every item in its place. A lifetime of careful order packed into this small space. The dresser drawers slid open with practiced ease, revealing neatly folded sweaters and blouses that smelled faintly of mothballs. Rachel worked methodically, packing clothes into garbage bags for donation, sorting keepsakes into boxes labeled save or toss. Most of what she found held little meaning. A scarf knitted decades ago, a cracked ceramic figurine from some long-forgotten Christmas. But then, tucked deep behind the bottom drawer, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. It was an envelope, brittle with age, its edges yellowed and frayed. Rachel pulled it free, frowning as she turned it over in her hands. The postmark read October 1971, the ink faded but still legible. Below it, scrawled in looping cursive, was a return address. Agnes F., Pine Hollow, Vermont. Pine Hollow? Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. She'd never heard her mother mention that name before. In fact, Eleanor rarely spoke about her life before marrying James, before Rachel was born. Those years were shrouded in mystery, dismissed with vague comments about working odd jobs and traveling around. This letter, this piece of history, felt like a crack in the carefully constructed facade Eleanor had built around herself. Her heart pounded as she examined the envelope more closely. Her mother's name was written on the front in the same elegant handwriting. Eleanor Whitmore, née Hayes. The seal was unbroken, the flap tucked tightly inside. Agnes F. had sent this letter nearly 50 years ago, and Eleanor had never opened it. Rachel hesitated, her fingers hovering over the edge of the envelope. She shouldn't open it, that much was clear. Whatever secrets lay within weren't hers to uncover. But curiosity gnawed at her, sharp and insistent. Who was Agnes? What could she have written that Eleanor would choose to hide away, unread, for all these years? With a pang of guilt, Rachel set the letter aside on the dresser and continued her task, trying to push it from her mind. She filled another bag with clothes, sorted through a box of old receipts, and stacked books onto the growing pile destined for the thrift store. Yet, every time she glanced at the envelope, it seemed to glow brighter, calling to her like a siren song. Finally, unable to resist any longer, she picked it up again. The paper crinkled softly beneath her touch, delicate as autumn leaves. Slowly, reluctantly, she unfolded the flap and slid out the single sheet of stationery inside. The handwriting was smaller now, cramped and urgent, as though the writer had been afraid of running out of space or time. Eleanor. I never told anyone what we saw that day, not even after everything fell apart. I don't know why I'm writing this now. It's been years, hasn't it? Maybe because I can't carry it anymore. Maybe because you deserve to know the truth. Do you remember the lake? Of course you do. How could you forget? That water. It swallowed so much more than just him. I think about it sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, about the way the ripples spread, wider and wider until they touched us all. Do you ever wonder if we could have stopped it? If we should have tried harder? I'm sorry, Ellie. For everything, and for nothing. Words feel useless now, don't they? But I had to try. You'll understand someday, I hope. Yours always, Agnes. Rachel's hands trembled as she lowered the letter, her stomach churning with unease. What lake? What had they seen? The questions swirled in her mind like storm clouds, dark and impenetrable. She read the words again, searching for clues, for context, but they offered nothing concrete, only fragments of a story she didn't yet understand. For a moment, she considered calling Eleanor, asking her directly about Agnes and the letter, but the image of their last conversation rose unbidden in her mind. The anger in Rachel's voice, the hurt in Eleanor's eyes. She couldn't bear to hear her mother's defensiveness, her evasions. Not now. Not yet. Instead, Rachel folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. She placed it in the save box, telling herself she'd deal with it later. For now, she needed distance, from the house, from the memories, from the weight of unanswered questions. But as she carried the box downstairs and set it beside the others, she couldn't shake the feeling that the letter was watching her. Waiting, whispering secrets she wasn't ready to hear. And somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of exhaustion and regret, Rachel knew one thing for certain. Whatever Eleanor had buried in her past, it wasn't going to stay buried forever. The phone rang 3 times before the motel clerk answered. His voice bored and nasal. Rachel gripped the receiver tightly, her knuckles white as she forced herself to stay calm. Yes, hi, she began, trying to keep her tone steady. I'm looking for my mother, Eleanor Whitmore. She was supposed to check in 2 nights ago. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of rustling papers. "Eleanor Whitmore?" the clerk repeated, dragging out the syllables like he'd never heard the name before. "Let me check." Rachel's stomach churned as she waited, staring at the kitchen counter where she'd left the yellowed envelope from Agnes F. The letter felt heavier now, its words burning into her mind even though she'd tried not to think about them. What lake? What had they seen? "Nope," the clerk said finally, popping the pie with an indifference that made Rachel's skin crawl. "No record of her here." Her heart sank. "Are you sure? She might have used a different last name, or maybe she didn't sign in properly." Another pause. Then, "Nah, I would have noticed someone like that. Older woman, right? With a suitcase?" "Yes," Rachel said, sitting up straighter. "Did you see her?" "Well," the clerk hesitated, and Rachel could practically hear the gears turning in his head. "Yeah, okay. There was an older lady who came in late that night, but she didn't stay long." Rachel's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, she didn't stay long?" "She checked in, yeah, but then she got a call. Made one too, actually. After that, she just packed up and left." "Left?" Rachel echoed, her voice rising. "Where did she go?" "How should I know?" The clerk sounded annoyed now, defensive. "Look, lady, people come and go all the time. I don't ask questions." Rachel clenched her jaw, fighting back frustration. "Do you at least have the number she called, or the number that called her?" "I don't know." There was a beat of silence, then the scrape of a chair against tile. "Hang on." She listened as he shuffled through something. Papers, maybe, and muttered under his breath. Finally, he came back on the line. "Yeah, okay, I found it. She made one outgoing call, local number. But when I tried calling it back earlier today, it was disconnected." "Disconnected?" Rachel repeated numbly. Her thoughts raced, panic bubbling just beneath the surface. Where had Mother gone? And why hadn't she told anyone? "Sorry, ma'am," the clerk said, his tone flat. "That's all I got." "Thank you," Rachel managed, though her voice cracked on the words. She hung up quickly, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. For a moment, she sat frozen, staring at nothing. Then, without thinking, she grabbed her coat and keys and headed out the door. The drive to the police station was a blur of rain-slicked roads and fragmented memories. Memories of her mother's quiet strength after James died, how she'd held everything together. Not just for Rachel, but for everyone. How she'd smiled through tears at the funeral, greeting friends and family with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. But now, sitting alone in the sterile waiting room of the local precinct, Rachel wondered if that strength had been real, or if it had been a mask, hiding cracks no one had bothered to notice. "Miss Whitmore." A young officer approached her, clipboard in hand. His expression was polite but distant, the kind reserved for cases deemed low priority. "You filed a missing person report?" "Yes," Rachel said, standing abruptly. "My mother. She's 68 years old, and I haven't heard from her in 2 days." The officer nodded, jotting something down. "When did you last speak to her?" 2 nights ago," Rachel replied, her voice tight. We argued about finances, about caregiving." She hesitated, shame coloring her words. "I dropped her off at a motel, but the clerk says she never actually stayed there." The officer raised an eyebrow. "And you're certain she didn't just leave on her own?" Rachel bristled. "Of course, I'm not certain. That's why I'm here. Look, she's elderly. She has health issues. She wouldn't just disappear like this." He gave her a sympathetic look, though it felt rehearsed. "Ma'am, we get reports like this all the time. Most of the time, it turns out they've gone somewhere voluntarily, without telling anyone. But this isn't most of the time, Rachel snapped, her anger spilling over. This is my mother. Something's wrong. I can feel it. The officer sighed, flipping his pen closed. All right, Miss Whitmore. We'll file the report and keep an eye out. But until we have more information. That's it, Rachel interrupted, incredulous. You're not going to do anything. We'll do what we can, he said evenly, though his tone suggested otherwise. In the meantime, try reaching out to any friends or family members she might have contacted. Sometimes these things work themselves out. Rachel wanted to scream, to demand action, to shake him until he understood how urgent this felt. But instead, she bit her tongue and nodded stiffly. Arguing wouldn't help, not now, not with him. Back in her car, the rain pounded against the windshield as she stared at the steering wheel, tears blurring her vision. She thought of her father again, of the way Eleanor had carried on after his death, with dignity, with purpose. Had it all been an act? A performance meant to shield Rachel from the truth? Or had Eleanor simply learned to bury her pain so deeply that even she forgot where it lay? Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, startling her. It was a text from a friend. Thinking of you. Let me know if you need anything. Rachel stared at the message, grateful for the sentiment, but hollowed out by the realization that no one else truly understood what she was facing. No one except Eleanor herself. And now, Eleanor was gone. As the minutes ticked by, Rachel's mind kept circling back to the motel clerk's words. She made one outgoing call, to a number that's now disconnected. Who had Eleanor reached out to, and why had whoever answered been unreachable ever since? The questions pressed against her chest, heavy and relentless. But beneath the fear and confusion, another emotion stirred. Determination. If the police weren't going to find her mother, then Rachel would have to do it herself. Starting with that disconnected number. She started the car and pulled away from the curb, her resolve hardening with every mile. Somewhere out there, Eleanor was waiting. And Rachel wasn't about to give up. Not until she found her. The drive to Pine Hollow was longer than Rachel had anticipated. The winding roads carving through dense forests and misty hills. By the time she arrived, twilight had settled over the town like a damp shroud. The air smelled of pine needles and earth, and the streets were eerily quiet, as if the entire place had been holding its breath for decades. She parked her car in front of the tiny library, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read Pine Hollow Public Library inside. The scent of old books mingled with dust, creating an atmosphere both comforting and suffocating. A single desk lamp illuminated the circulation desk, where an elderly woman sat hunched over a crossword puzzle. Her glasses dangled precariously from a chain around her neck, and her silver hair was pulled back into a loose bun. "Can I help you?" the librarian asked, looking up with sharp, knowing eyes. Rachel approached cautiously, clutching the yellowed envelope in one hand. "I'm looking for information about someone who lived here a long time ago. Eleanor Whitmore. She grew up in Pine Hollow." The librarian's expression shifted subtly, her lips pressing together in what might have been recognition or reluctance. "Eleanor Whitmore," she repeated softly, setting down her pen. "That name brings back memories." Rachel leaned forward, heart pounding. "Do you know her?" "I knew of her," the woman said, carefully, folding her hands on the desk. "The Whitmores used to live out on Larkspur Lane. Big house, beautiful place, until—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "It's been years since anyone's talked about them." "Until what?" Rachel pressed, frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "What happened to the house?" "To my mother?" The librarian hesitated, glancing toward the window as though expecting someone or something to appear. Finally, she sighed. There was a tragedy, something involving one of the Whitmore girls. People didn't talk about it much after it happened. Too painful, I suppose. One of the Whitmore girls? Rachel echoed, her voice trembling. You mean Eleanor? The woman gave her a measured look, neither confirming nor denying. All I'll say is this. Some things are better left buried. Whatever you're looking for, child, you might not want to find it. Her words sent a chill down Rachel's spine, but she forced herself to nod. Thank you. Can you tell me how to get to Larkspur Lane? The librarian hesitated again, then reached for a map tucked under the counter. She marked the route with a shaky hand, her movements deliberate yet tinged with unease. Be careful, she murmured as Rachel took the map. Old houses hold old secrets. Larkspur Lane was little more than a dirt path lined with overgrown trees, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. At the end of the road stood the remains of the Whitmore house, a crumbling Victorian structure swallowed by vines and decay. The once grand porch sagged under the weight of time, and shattered windows stared out like empty eye sockets. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she stepped out of the car, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. The air was colder here, carrying the faint scent of mildew and wet leaves. She walked slowly toward the house, each step stirring up clouds of dust. The front door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the floorboards groaned beneath her weight, protesting her presence. Sunlight filtered weakly through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the rotting furniture. Rachel moved deeper into the house, her pulse quickening with every step. In the corner of what must have once been the living room, she found an old fireplace mantel adorned with faded photographs. Most were too damaged to make out, but one caught her eye. A young Eleanor standing beside another girl, their arms slung casually around each other's shoulders. They looked happy, carefree, so unlike the mother Rachel knew. Beneath the photo frame lay a scrapbook half buried in debris. Its cover was worn and cracked, but when Rachel opened it, she discovered pages filled with newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and Polaroid snapshots. One clipping stood out. Its headline smudged but legible. Local teen disappears after lake tragedy. Her hands trembled as she scanned the article. It mentioned a boy named Thomas Grayson, whose body had been recovered from nearby Willow Lake after a boating accident. Witnesses claimed 2 teenage girls had been with him that day, but neither had come forward with details. The case remained unsolved. Rachel's stomach churned as pieces began to fall into place, or rather, as gaps widened further. Was this the lake Agnes had written about? Had Eleanor been one of those girls? And if so, why had she never spoken of it? A sudden noise startled her, a soft thud from upstairs. Her head snapped up, heart racing. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing through the hollow house. No answer came, only the sound of wind whistling through the broken windows. She told herself it was nothing, just the settling of an ancient structure. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching her from the shadows. And worse still, she couldn't escape the growing certainty that her mother's disappearance was tied to this place, and to whatever secrets it refused to let go. The house felt lonelier than ever when Rachel returned, its silence pressing against her like a weight. She dropped her bag by the door and headed straight for the box labeled Save, the one containing Eleanor's hidden mementos. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the contents. Photographs, letters, trinkets, all fragments of a life Rachel realized she barely understood. And then she found it. a small creased photograph tucked into the pages of an old diary. The edges were soft from years of handling, the colors faded, but still vivid enough to reveal two young girls standing in front of a rickety treehouse. One of them was unmistakably Eleanor, younger, freckled, smiling with a brightness Rachel had rarely seen in her adult mother. The other girl wore her dark hair in braids, her arm wrapped protectively around Eleanor's shoulders. A white bandage peeked out from beneath the sleeve of her dress, stark against her tanned skin. Rachel flipped the photo over, her breath catching at the neat handwriting on the back. E.M. Summer, 71. M. Who was M? Her mind raced, sifting through memories of family stories, holidays, and idle conversations. There had been no mention of a sister, no whispered anecdotes about childhood adventures or sibling rivalries. Just Eleanor, alone in her quiet strength after James's death, carrying the weight of their family history without complaint, or so Rachel had thought. She sat down heavily on the floor, clutching the photograph as if it might vanish if she let go. Guilt swelled inside her, thick and suffocating. How could she have lived 38 years without asking who her mother truly was, without wondering about the gaps in her story, the silences that stretched too long? She'd always assumed Eleanor was simply private, reserved, a product of her generation. But now, staring at the face of this mysterious girl, Rachel wondered how much she'd taken for granted. The guilt wasn't just for now. It was for everything. For dropping Eleanor off at that motel, yes, but also for all the time she dismissed her mother's quirks and habits as eccentricities rather than clues. For never noticing the sadness behind her smiles, or the way she sometimes lingered over old photographs, lost in thought. For assuming she knew her mother when, in truth, she hadn't even scratched the surface. Rachel traced the faint pencil marks on the back of the photo, her fingers trembling. E.M. Two girls bound together by something deeper than friendship, perhaps. Something that ended abruptly, violently, leaving scars neither could escape. Her gaze drifted to the hollowed-out book sitting nearby, the tarnished key still nestled within its secret compartment. Whatever it unlocked, whatever secrets it guarded, Rachel suddenly felt certain it was tied to this, the lake, the tragedy, the girl named M. But where did Eleanor fit into all of this? Had she tried to save Thomas Grayson that day, or had she failed, carrying the guilt ever since? The questions swirled faster, darker, until they blurred into a single, overwhelming certainty. Eleanor had spent her entire life running from something, from someone. And now, Rachel feared she might be too late to uncover the truth and to bring her mother home. Later that night, unable to sleep, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with the photograph and a glass of water she hadn't touched. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying whispers of storms yet to come. Inside, the house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by absence. Every creak of the floorboards reminded her of Eleanor's steady presence. Every shadow hinted at the secrets she'd kept buried. Rachel pulled out her phone and opened the note app, typing furiously. Who is M? What happened at Willow Lake? Why did Agnes write to Eleanor after all these years? Each question begged another, each answer leading only to more uncertainty. Yet, amidst the chaos, one thing became clear. Eleanor wasn't just missing. She was searching for closure, redemption, or maybe forgiveness. And Rachel owed it to her, to both of them, to follow the trail wherever it led. Even if it meant confronting truths she wasn't ready to face. The hospice center smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. A strange blend meant to soothe, but instead only underscored the fragility of life within its walls. Rachel hesitated outside room 14. her knuckles hovering over the doorframe as she gathered her courage. This was it. The moment she'd been driving toward since leaving Pine Hollow. The woman inside had known Eleanor once, intimately enough to write that letter. Intimately enough, perhaps, to know what happened to Miriam. She knocked softly before stepping in, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Agnes Foster lay propped up against a mountain of pillows, her frail body almost swallowed by the hospital bed. Tubes snaked from her arms to machines that hummed steadily beside her, their rhythmic beeping a reminder of how little time either of them might have left for answers. Agnes turned her head slowly, her gaze clouded with pain and medication. But when Rachel introduced herself, "I'm Rachel Whitmore, Eleanor's daughter," something flickered in those faded blue eyes. Recognition? Regret? Fear? "Eleanor," Agnes whispered, her voice thin as paper. "Oh, Ellie." Rachel pulled a chair close, clutching the yellowed envelope tightly in her lap. "You wrote her this letter," she began gently, holding it out for Agnes to see. "Why now? After all these years?" Agnes stared at the envelope like it might burn her, tears welling up in her eyes. For a long moment she said nothing, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Then, finally, she spoke, her words slow and deliberate, each syllable heavy with unspoken weight. "That summer, it destroyed us." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she reached for a glass of water on the bedside table. Rachel helped steady it for her, her heart pounding as she waited for Agnes to continue. Miriam and Eleanor, they were inseparable, always running off into the woods behind the house, building forts, telling secrets. Agnes paused, closing her eyes as though summoning the memory took more strength than she had left. They went out there one afternoon in July, just the two of them. Only Eleanor came back. Rachel's stomach churned, her grip tightening on the armrests of the chair. She'd suspected something terrible had happened to Miriam, but hearing it aloud made the reality sink deeper, sharper. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Agnes shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No one knows. Eleanor wouldn't talk about it, not to me, not to anyone. They questioned her, of course. The police, the neighbors, even our parents. But she just shut down. Wouldn't say a word." "And Miriam?" Rachel pressed, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. "Was there ever any sign of her?" "Nothing." Agnes's voice broke again, raw and broken. Not a trace. It was like the earth opened up and swallowed her whole. Rachel felt the room tilt slightly, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of her mother, the quiet, composed woman who raised her, with the girl who emerged alone from those woods. What had she seen? What had she done, or failed to do? "She changed after that," Agnes continued, her tone softer now, tinged with sorrow. "Ellie was never the same. She used to laugh so easily, you know. Used to light up every room she walked into. But after that summer..." She trailed off, shaking her head. It was like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Like she couldn't forgive herself for whatever happened. Rachel swallowed hard, the lump in her throat refusing to budge. "Do you think she knows where Miriam is?" Agnes looked away, her gaze drifting toward the window where rain streaked the glass. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "But if she does, I hope she finds peace before it's too late." The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with decades of grief and unanswered questions. Rachel sat motionless, her thoughts racing. If Eleanor knew something about Miriam's fate, why hadn't she spoken up? Why had she let the mystery linger, poisoning her own life along with everyone else's. As Agnes drifted off to sleep, exhausted by the effort of reliving old wounds, Rachel slipped the envelope back into her bag and rose silently from the chair. Before stepping out, she glanced back at the fragile figure in the bed, guilt twisting in her chest. For 50 years, Agnes had carried this burden alongside Eleanor, and now Rachel carried it too. On the drive home, the storm intensified, rain hammering against the windshield as if trying to wash away the past. But some things couldn't be erased, not by water, not by time. As Rachel gripped the steering wheel, her mind replayed Agnes's final words. If she does, I hope she finds peace before it's too late. Peace, or truth, maybe both. And somewhere deep inside, Rachel knew she wasn't just searching for her mother anymore. She was searching for redemption. For all of them. The morning after visiting Agnes, Rachel returned to Pine Hollow with a growing sense of unease. The storm had passed, leaving behind damp streets and an oppressive quiet that seemed to seep into her bones. She started at the local diner, where coffee brewed strong and gossip flowed even stronger. It didn't take long for word to spread. Eleanor Whitmore's daughter was asking questions. At first, people were polite but evasive. A waitress wiped down tables too vigorously, avoiding eye contact as she muttered, "That was a long time ago." An elderly man sipping black coffee at the counter simply shook his head when Rachel approached him. "Some things are best left alone," he said gruffly, pushing away his mug. But persistence paid off, or so it seemed. By midday, Rachel found herself sitting across from Harold Grayson, Thomas Grayson's younger brother, now a retired deputy sheriff. His weathered face betrayed little emotion as he listened to her story, his hands folded tightly on the scarred wooden table of his modest home. "You're digging up old dirt," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "Not everyone's going to appreciate that." "I just want to find my mother," Rachel replied, leaning forward earnestly. "If there's something you know, anything, it might help me understand why she disappeared." Harold studied her for a moment, then sighed and reached into a drawer beside him. He pulled out a folder, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. Inside were fragments of reports, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all incomplete, some torn or smudged beyond legibility. One page caught Rachel's attention immediately. A coroner's report for Thomas Grayson, with a single line circled in red ink. Trauma consistent with foul play suspected. Rachel's breath hitched as she traced the words with trembling fingers. What does this mean? Who thought it was foul play? Harold hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. We all did, at first. But nothing stuck. No evidence. No witnesses willing to talk. Just whispers. He tapped the folder meaningfully. Your grandparents, they weren't exactly model citizens. Folks around here knew they had skeletons in their closets. When Miriam went missing, tongues wagged louder than ever. What kind of skeletons? Rachel pressed, dread pooling in her stomach. He leaned back, his expression grim. Debts, secrets, rumors about how far they'd go to protect their reputation. When the heat got too much, someone suggested the Whitmores leave town. Quietly, for everyone's sake. For everyone's sake, Rachel echoed bitterly. Or to bury the truth. Harold shrugged, though his silence spoke volumes. Look, I'm not saying your mother did anything wrong, but she was the last one seen with Miriam. And after what happened at Willow Lake. He let the sentence hang, unfinished but heavy with implication. Rachel felt sick, her mind racing to piece together the fragments of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted solved. If Eleanor had been involved, if she'd somehow caused Miriam's disappearance, why hadn't anyone said anything? Why had the case been swept under the rug? By late afternoon, Rachel's frustration had turned to anger. She sat in her car outside the library, staring at the torn report she'd managed to pocket during her conversation with Harold. The words blurred together as tears welled in her eyes. How could she reconcile the image of her mother, the woman who sang lullabies to her as a child, who held her hand through every heartbreak, with the shadowy figure emerging from these stories? A knock on the passenger side window startled her. Startled, she looked up to see a middle-aged woman peering in cautiously. Rolling down the window, Rachel recognized her as one of the neighbors she'd spoken to earlier that day. "You shouldn't be poking around like this," the woman said, her tone hushed but urgent. "People don't forget, and they don't forgive easily." "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," Rachel insisted, though her voice wavered. "I just need answers." The woman glanced over her shoulder, ensuring no one else was listening. "Listen carefully," she whispered. "There's a reason the Whitmores left Pine Hollow. Your grandmother, she made sure no charges were filed against anyone, paid off the right people, silenced the wrong ones. Whatever happened to Miriam, it's buried deep, deeper than you can imagine." Rachel's chest tightened. "Are you saying my family covered it up?" The woman didn't answer directly, instead pressing a folded scrap of paper into Rachel's hand. "This fell out of the archives when I was looking for something else. Maybe it'll help, or maybe it'll break your heart. Either way, tread carefully." With that, she hurried away, disappearing into the crowd before Rachel could ask more questions. Unfolding the paper, Rachel found a faded photograph of two girls standing by the edge of Willow Lake. The same treehouse visible in the distance. One girl wore a bandage on her arm. The other clutched a small wooden box. Her breath caught. It was Eleanor and Miriam again, but this time there was something new in the image. Fear. In the background, barely visible beneath the ripples of the lake, was the unmistakable outline of a human figure submerged just below the surface. Rachel stared at the photo, her pulse thundering in her ears. Was this proof, or merely another ghost haunting her mother's past? And if Eleanor truly was responsible for Miriam's fate, could Rachel forgive her? The woods behind the Whitmore house were darker than Rachel remembered, the towering trees casting long shadows that swallowed the light. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves, and every step she took seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the stillness. She clutched the faded photograph tightly in one hand, its edges soft and worn from years of handling. It had led her here, to this place where Eleanor's secrets had taken root decades ago. After what felt like an eternity of trudging through underbrush, she spotted it. The remnants of the treehouse, perched precariously among gnarled branches. Time and weather had not been kind. Half the structure had collapsed, leaving jagged planks jutting out like broken bones. But something about it, the way it leaned slightly forward, as if bowing under the weight of memory, made Rachel pause. She climbed up slowly, testing each board before putting her full weight on it. Inside, the space was smaller than she'd imagined, barely large enough for two girls to sit comfortably. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the floorboards groaned beneath her feet. In the center of the tiny room, partially hidden beneath a layer of dirt and leaves, was a rusted tin box. Her hands trembled as she knelt down and opened it. The contents spilled out onto the floor, a scattering of artifacts frozen in time. There were more photographs, their colors faded but still recognizable. One showed Eleanor and Miriam laughing together, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. Another captured them crouched by the lake, skipping stones across its surface. A rusted necklace lay tangled among the images, its heart-shaped pendant dull with age. But it was the small leather-bound diary that caught Rachel's attention. Its cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed and fragile. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized her mother's neat handwriting. The entries began innocently enough, filled with descriptions of lazy summer days and whispered dreams shared between best friends. But as Rachel turned the pages, the tone shifted, growing darker, heavier, weighed down by guilt and fear. "Miriam says we can trust them," one entry read. "But I don't know anymore. They promised they'd leave us alone if we stayed quiet. What choice do we have?" Rachel's heart pounded as she flipped ahead, scanning the words that revealed a side of her mother she'd never known. Eleanor hadn't been reckless or cruel, as Rachel had begun to suspect. Instead, she'd been terrified of losing Miriam, of making things worse. The diary painted a picture of a girl who loved deeply and fiercely, willing to carry any burden to protect those she cared about. And then she found it. The final entry, scrawled hastily in ink so dark it nearly bled through the page. "I should have told someone, but they said they'd hurt her if I did." Rachel froze, the world around her dissolving into silence. Her fingers traced the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Who were they? What had they threatened to do? And why had Eleanor kept silent all these years? A sudden noise startled her, a branch snapping somewhere below. She froze, her pulse racing as she strained to listen. The forest was eerily quiet now, save for the distant rustle of leaves. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching her from the shadows. Forcing herself to focus, Rachel gathered the items back into the tin box and tucked it under her arm. As she descended from the treehouse, the weight of the diary pressed against her chest, both literal and metaphorical. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted her movement. When she reached the edge of the woods, the sight of the crumbling Whitmore house brought a fresh wave of emotion crashing over her. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a tragedy. A story of love and loss, of innocence stolen too soon. And at its center was Eleanor, carrying the weight of decisions made when she was barely more than a child. As Rachel stood there staring at the house, tears blurred her vision. She thought of her mother, the woman who had raised her with quiet strength and unwavering devotion. How much of that strength had been forged in the fires of guilt and grief? How many nights had Eleanor lain awake, haunted by the choices she'd made? For the first time, Rachel understood why her mother had always seemed so distant, so guarded. It wasn't because she didn't care. It was because she cared too much. Too much to risk trusting anyone again. Too much to let go of the past. And now, Rachel realized, it was up to her to finish what Eleanor had started. To uncover the truth, not to judge, but to heal. Whatever awaited her next, she knew one thing for certain. The answers lay buried deeper than she'd ever imagined. And finding them would change everything. The kitchen table was cluttered with fragments of the past. Photographs, torn reports, and the tin box from the treehouse. But it was the diary that held Rachel's attention now, its pages spread open under the harsh glare of the overhead light. She'd read through it once already, her heart breaking with each entry, but something nagged at her. A detail she'd missed. Her fingers traced the margins of one page, where a name had been scribbled repeatedly. Mr. C. At first glance it seemed innocuous, a stray thought or inside joke between Eleanor and Miriam. But as Rachel flipped through the diary, she found the initials again and again, sometimes circled, sometimes crossed out, always accompanied by phrases like, "He knows," or "Don't tell him." A chill ran down her spine. Who was Mr. C? And why had Eleanor felt compelled to write his name so often? Rachel opened her laptop and began searching Pine Hollow's historical archives, cross-referencing names from the early 1970s. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. A man named Henry Claymore, a former teacher at Pine Hollow High School. According to public records, he taught there for nearly a decade before being abruptly transferred in the fall of 1971. No explanation was given. No new position listed. Just gone. Her pulse quickened as she dug deeper. Census data placed Claymore living 2 doors down from the Whitmores on Larkspur Lane. Neighbors. Close enough to see, to hear, to notice things. And yet, despite his proximity to the tragedy, his name never appeared in any official report. No charges filed. No obituary. No trace of him after that summer. Rachel stared at the screen, her mind racing. What had happened to Claymore? Why had he disappeared without a word, and how did he fit into Eleanor's story? She returned to the diary, rereading passages with fresh eyes. The entries about them, the vague threats, the warnings not to speak, now took on a sinister tone. If Claymore was involved, if he'd somehow exploited Eleanor and Miriam's silence, the possibilities were too horrifying to fully consider. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as realization dawned. Her mother hadn't been complicit in Miriam's disappearance. She'd been trying to protect her. Protect both of them. From Claymore. From whatever hold he'd had over them. They said they'd hurt her if I did. The words echoed in Rachel's mind, sharper now, more urgent. Eleanor had stayed silent because she believed speaking up would put Miriam in danger. Perhaps Claymore had threatened violence, or worse, if the truth came out. And when Miriam vanished, Eleanor must have blamed herself entirely. Blamed herself for failing to save her best friend. Rachel buried her face in her hands, sobs shaking her shoulders. All these years, she'd assumed her mother's reserve was a choice, a personality trait ingrained by habit. But it wasn't. It was armor, built layer by painful layer, to shield herself and others from harm. Eleanor had sacrificed her own peace to keep secrets she thought might protect those she loved. As the tears subsided, Rachel wiped her face and reached for her phone. She needed answers. Real ones. Not whispers or half-truths, but proof of what had happened that summer. Proof that could finally bring closure. Not just for Eleanor, but for everyone who'd been left behind. Her thumb hovered over Harold Grayson's number, hesitating. He'd hinted at corruption, at cover-ups orchestrated by powerful families. Had the Whitmores struck a deal to bury the truth about Claymore? Or had someone else intervened, silencing the case before it could unravel further? Whatever the answer, Rachel knew she couldn't stop now. For Eleanor, for Miriam, for the girl in the photograph who smiled so brightly, unaware of the darkness lurking just beyond the frame. And maybe for herself. Because understanding her mother's pain meant understanding her own. The phone call came late in the evening, just as Rachel was about to give up for the day. Her laptop sat open on the kitchen table, surrounded by notes and photographs, its screen casting a pale glow across her weary face. When her cell buzzed against the wood surface, she almost didn't answer. It felt like another dead end waiting to happen. But something about the unknown number made her hesitate. "Miss Whitmore?" The voice on the other end was soft but firm, belonging to someone used to navigating delicate situations. "This is Patricia Langley, a social worker with elder care services. I think I may have found someone you've been looking for." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "A woman named Miriam Clay," Patricia replied cautiously. "She's been in our care for several years now, though she goes by a different name, Miriam Foster. We recently uncovered some old records during a routine audit, and your inquiry matched enough details that we felt compelled to reach out." Rachel gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Is she okay?" Patricia hesitated. "Physically, yes, but emotionally it's complicated. She suffers from selective mutism and significant trauma-related memory gaps. It's possible she won't be able to provide many answers. Still, if you'd like to visit her, I believe it could help both of you." "Yes," Rachel said without hesitation. "When can I see her?" The assisted living facility was tucked into the outskirts of a neighboring town, its brick exterior unassuming but well-maintained. Rachel's hands trembled as she signed in at the front desk, clutching the photograph of Eleanor and Miriam tightly in her pocket. Patricia met her in the lobby, her expression kind but guarded. "She doesn't speak often," Patricia warned gently as they walked down a quiet hallway lined with cheerful paintings and potted plants. "And when she does, it's usually fragmented. Be patient with her." Rachel nodded, her throat dry as they stopped outside a door marked Room 17. Before knocking, Patricia gave her one last reassuring smile, then stepped aside to let Rachel enter alone. The room was small but bright, sunlight streaming through sheer curtains to illuminate a figure seated by the window. An elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, her silver hair tied back in a loose bun, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She turned slowly at the sound of Rachel's approach, her eyes widening slightly as they took in the stranger before her. Rachel swallowed hard, pulling the photograph from her pocket. "Do you recognize this?" she asked softly, holding it out. Miriam's gaze dropped to the image, and for a moment she simply stared. Then, slowly, tears began to well in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. Her lips parted, trembling, and she reached out a shaky hand to touch the photo. "Ellie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, Ellie." Rachel's breath caught. "You remember her?" Miriam nodded, her fingers tracing the outline of Eleanor's face in the picture. "She saved me," she murmured, her words halting but clear. "She tried to protect me." Rachel sank into the chair beside her, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. "From what, Miriam? What happened that summer?" Miriam closed her eyes, her breathing shallow as if bracing herself for the memories. He hurt us," she said finally, her voice breaking. "Mr. Claymore, he lived next door. He watched us, followed us. One night he came into the house. My parents, they didn't stop him. They wouldn't." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Rachel's stomach churned, nausea rising in waves. "What did Eleanor do?" "She helped me run," Miriam continued, her words spilling out faster now, desperate to be heard. "We hid in the woods, in the treehouse. She told me to stay quiet, to wait until it was safe. But then they came looking for me, for both of us. Ellie told them I was gone, that I'd drowned in the lake." Rachel's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the story. "They believed her?" "For a while," Miriam said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But they kept asking questions, kept watching. Your grandparents, they sent me away, changed my name, made sure no one could find me. And Ellie, she stayed behind to take the blame." Tears streamed down Rachel's face as everything clicked into place. Eleanor hadn't abandoned Miriam. She'd sacrificed herself to save her, to shield her from further harm. The guilt, The silence, the secrets, it all made sense now. Her mother had carried the burden of that lie for over 50 years, letting the world believe she was responsible for Miriam's disappearance because it meant keeping her safe. "And you?" Rachel asked gently, reaching out to take Miriam's hand. "Why didn't you ever come forward? Tell people you were alive?" Miriam shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I couldn't. Every time I tried, I froze. I couldn't talk about it, about him, about what happened. I thought everyone would hate me. Blame me for leaving Ellie behind." Rachel squeezed her hand, her own voice thick with emotion. "No one blames you, Miriam. You survived. That's what matters." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled only with the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the distant chirping of birds outside. Finally, Miriam looked up, her eyes searching Rachel's face. "Where is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Ellie?" Rachel's heart ached at the question, at the raw hope in Miriam's eyes. She didn't know where Eleanor was, not yet, but she vowed silently, fiercely, to find her. Not just for herself, but for the two girls who had once stood side by side in front of a treehouse, believing they could outrun the darkness. "We'll find her," Rachel promised, her voice steady despite the tears. "Together." The coastal town of Seabrook was a world away from Pine Hollow. Its streets lined with salt-kissed cottages, its air tinged with the sharp scent of the ocean. Rachel parked her car near the edge of the harbor, where seagulls wheeled overhead and fishing boats bobbed lazily in the water. She'd spent days piecing together Eleanor's trail. A bus ticket purchased under an assumed name, a utility bill for a small apartment, and finally, a tip from a local florist who remembered hiring a quiet woman named Ellen Hayes. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the flower shop, the bell above the door jingling softly. The interior was warm and fragrant, filled with bouquets of fresh blooms arranged in mismatched vases. And there, behind the counter, stood Eleanor. Or rather, Ellen. Her mother looked older than Rachel remembered, her hair streaked with silver and her face lined with years of weariness. But her hands moved with the same steady grace as they wrapped stems in tissue paper, oblivious to the storm about to break. "Can I help you?" Eleanor asked, without looking up, her voice polite but distant. Rachel froze, her throat tightening at the sound of it. It had been weeks since their last conversation. A lifetime ago, really. And yet here she was, standing face to face with the woman who had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Mom," Rachel said softly, her voice cracking on the single word. Eleanor's hands stilled mid-motion, the bouquet slipping slightly from her grasp. Slowly, she raised her head, her eyes widening as recognition dawned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The shop seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them suspended in time. "Rachel," Eleanor whispered finally, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "I found you," Rachel replied simply, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't give up this time." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the counter, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You shouldn't have come," she murmured, more to herself than to Rachel. "It's better if I stay gone." "No," Rachel said firmly, stepping closer. "It's not better. None of this is better, not for you, not for me, and certainly not for Miriam." At the mention of the name, Eleanor flinched visibly, her breath hitching. "Miriam? You found her?" Rachel nodded, pulling out the photograph of the two girls by the treehouse. "She's alive, Mom. She's safe, and she remembers what you did for her." Eleanor stared at the photo, her expression unreadable but achingly familiar. After a long silence, she sank onto a stool behind the counter, her shoulders slumping under the weight of decades-old secrets. "I wanted to disappear before the truth did," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator cooling the flowers. "Before anyone else got hurt." Rachel crouched down beside her, reaching out tentatively to take her hand. "You saved her, Mom. You protected her when no one else would. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Eleanor shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Because I failed her. Because I let them think she was dead. Because every day since then, I've wondered if I could have done more." "You did everything you could," Rachel insisted, her own tears falling freely now. "More than anyone should have had to do you hear me? You were brave, you were strong, and you carried all of that guilt alone for 50 years. Eleanor looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "I never stopped loving her," she confessed, her voice breaking, "and I never stopped blaming myself." Rachel squeezed her hand tighter, willing her mother to feel the sincerity in her words. "It's okay to stop blaming yourself now. Miriam doesn't blame you. She cried when she saw your picture, Mom. She said you saved her." For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor smiled. A fragile, fleeting thing, but real nonetheless. "She always was stronger than she thought," she said softly, almost to herself. Rachel hesitated, then took a deep breath. "She wants to see you again, to reconnect, if you're ready." Eleanor's smile faltered, fear flickering in her eyes. "What if I can't face her? What if she hates me for staying away?" "She doesn't hate you," Rachel assured her, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "She loves you, just like I do." The words hung between them, raw and unspoken for far too long. Finally, Eleanor reached out, pulling Rachel into a tight embrace. They clung to each other, their tears mingling as years of pain and misunderstanding melted away. For the first time in Rachel's memory, her mother wasn't just holding her, she was leaning on her, trusting her. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor wiped her eyes and gave Rachel a shaky smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for believing in me." Rachel shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being my mom, for showing me how to fight for the people we love, even when it hurts." They sat together in silence for a while, letting the weight of everything settle around them. Outside, the tide rolled in, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. Somewhere in the distance, a seagull called, its cry echoing across the water. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt hope, not just for herself, but for her mother, for Miriam, and for the family they might still become. The reunion took place in a small park near Miriam's assisted living facility, where autumn leaves painted the ground in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor arrived first, her hands clutching a bouquet of wildflowers she'd arranged herself. Simple, yet heartfelt, much like the woman holding them. Rachel stood nearby, watching as her mother paced nervously, glancing toward the path every few seconds. When Miriam appeared, leaning heavily on a cane but smiling faintly, time seemed to stop. For a moment, neither woman moved, their eyes locked in a silent exchange that carried decades of longing, guilt, and love. Then, slowly, Eleanor stepped forward, extending the flowers with trembling hands. Miriam accepted them wordlessly, her gaze never leaving Eleanor's face. Tears streamed down both their cheeks as they reached for each other, their fingers intertwining like roots seeking soil. They didn't speak, not at first. Words felt too small, too fragile to contain the enormity of what they'd shared and lost. Instead, they simply held on, their shoulders shaking with sobs as Rachel looked on, tears streaming down her own face. It was Eleanor who broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "I'm so sorry, Mimi," she whispered, using the nickname from their youth. "I should have found a way to bring you home." Miriam shook her head, squeezing Eleanor's hand tighter. "You saved me," she said, her voice barely audible but filled with conviction. "That's all that matters." They stayed like that for a long time, surrounded by the rustling leaves and distant laughter of children playing nearby. Rachel lingered at the edge of the scene, giving them space while feeling profoundly grateful to witness it. This was healing, not perfect, not complete, but real. A beginning. Days later, Rachel returned to her own home, exhausted but lighter somehow, as if shedding layers of grief she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She sorted through mail piled up on the counter, pausing when she saw an envelope addressed to her in shaky handwriting. The return address read Miriam Foster, and her heart skipped a beat. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its words written carefully, as though chosen with great deliberation. "Dear Rachel, thank you for finding me. But more than that, thank you for uncovering the truth. Not just about what happened to me, but about your mother. She loved us both so fiercely, even when it cost her everything. There's something else I need to tell you, something I couldn't say out loud. It wasn't a stranger who hurt us that summer. It was your father. He came to our house one night, angry and desperate. We were scared of him, of what he might do. Your mother knew we couldn't go to the police without destroying your family, and she couldn't bear to take away the father you adored. So she lied. She told everyone I was gone, that I'd drowned, and she let the world believe she was to blame. All to protect you, to protect his memory. Please don't hate her for it. She only ever wanted to shield you from pain. With love, Miriam." Rachel sank onto the couch, the letter trembling in her hands. Her vision blurred as tears spilled over, hot and unrelenting. James Whitmore, the man she'd idolized, the man whose kindness and laughter had defined her childhood, had been capable of such darkness. And Eleanor had carried that secret too, sacrificing her own reputation to preserve Rachel's image of him. Her chest tightened as grief mingled with awe. How could someone bear boys who ran through the yard laughing so much? How could anyone love so deeply? Weeks passed before Rachel returned to Pine Hollow, this time with Eleanor by her side. The old Whitmore house on Larkspur Lane had new owners now. A young family with two rambunctious, oblivious to the shadows that once lingered there. Rachel approached the edge of the property, a sapling cradled in her arms. Eleanor watched silently as Rachel dug a small hole beneath the towering oak tree that still stood sentinel over the land. Together, they planted the young tree, its roots reaching deep into soil rich with history. As Rachel patted the earth firmly around the base, she glanced at her mother, who gave her a sad but knowing smile. "The past isn't gone," Eleanor said softly, "but it doesn't have to define us either." Rachel nodded, brushing dirt from her hands. "It's okay to remember," she replied, "as long as we keep growing." The wind stirred the branches above them, scattering golden leaves across the yard. Somewhere inside the house, the sound of children's laughter echoed faintly, a reminder that life moves forward even as it holds on to what came before. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt pause. Not because the answers were easy, but because they were true. Because love, no matter how flawed or complicated, always finds a way to bloom again.